So off screen, I did a few more adjustments to this. I changed the colors in the lookup table to better represent what was here. I added some of the reds, and then I think I also adjusted some of the oranges and blues a bit more. I went in and I added a layer where I redid the screen glow so it stood out better, and I did some manual painting where I sampled the colors with the LUT on and then painted a couple pixels here and there. So it was just to clean things up for when I was going to use this LUT. But now I'm going to convert this asset into using PBR, so I'll remove some of this to get to a place where I can work with it. First of all, I don't want to use the blackout layer anymore where I'm putting everything into the emissive channel, but I won't remove it completely in case I need it later. So I'll just hide it for now. And now we're getting shading back on this, and you can see that Pixel8r is not working on any of the other channels except for the diffuse. What I could do is turn on each individual channel in this one copy of Pixel8r, but it's going to apply the LUT and quantization settings that I have, as well as the dither settings to every channel, and I don't want that. So what I'm going to do instead is make duplicates of Pixel8r where it acts on each channel individually. So I'll make one that just acts on the diffuse, and one that just acts on the normals, and then one that works on everything else, and I'll call that one data. So for the normal channel, I'll disable color, and I'll turn on normal, and then I'll disable the lookup table for that. And then on the data one, I'll enable all of the other channels. On the data one, I don't need the height channel either, and I'll talk a bit about why later, but for now, I'll disable the quantization on that as well. So the way that Painter works is that the normal map that you've produced from your layer stack is going to be combined with your baked normals after the layer stack. And it will also do the same with ambient occlusion. The other thing that it does is convert the height information to normals, and then it also blends that with your normal map that's processed after the layer stack. So this is kind of working against Pixel8r, and we want to disable these effects. You can see that if I turn on the normal plus height plus mesh channel here, that because it's getting converted after the stack, but my document is at a resolution of 2048, it's now seeing these large pixels generated by Pixel8r as stair-stepping style changes. And we don't want that, so I'm going to manually convert this height information to normals inside of the layer stack. And I'll also bring my normal map from my mesh maps into the layer stack as well. So to begin with, I'm going to disable my normal map from my mesh maps, and the way that I'm going to do that is by changing it from a combine mode to a replace mode. And I also want to make sure that I don't have ambient occlusion getting combined, so I'll change it from multiply to replace as well. Now that it's lost most of its shading, I want to manually add that normal map into the layer stack so it gets combined properly. So I'll do that by adding a fill layer, and I'll rename it to Baked Normals, and then disable all of the channels that I have except for the normal channel, and I'll drag my Baked Normal in. By default, it doesn't look very good, and the reason why is because the color space is incorrect by default. So I need to go under the color space settings and change it to using the right normal orientation for my mesh. To verify this, I'll switch Pixel8r off, and I'll add some channels to this layer where we can preview the normal map on a glossy surface, so yeah, now it's completely seamless. Do remember that if you're making a PBR asset with normal maps, you need to follow the standard conventions of baking normals, which means that for every place that you have split the normals in your mesh, you also need to add a UV seam to that as well. But I want to stress, and this is something that a lot of people aren't aware of, the opposite is not actually true. So you don't have to split your normals wherever you have UV seams or separate islands. So I could actually put this all in one smoothing group and bake a normal map, and it would be totally fine with the exception that it might add more gradients into the normal map. And when you put that in a game engine and it gets compressed, it's probably not going to look very good because it has large sweeping gradients. So ideally what you want to do when you're making any kind of normal mapped asset is make sure that the shading of your low poly mesh before you've baked your normal maps as closely approximates the shading of the high poly as possible, so it reduces the difference between the two and the normal map doesn't have to do as much work. That will make it look much better under compression. I've actually used a technique on this called face-weighted normals, which allows me to reduce the skewing of the low poly before I've done my bake. And so if I disable my normal map here, you can see that the flat faces are still well preserved. And that's going to allow me to have less gradients in my normal map as well, which I'll show here. So for the retro diffuse version of this, if I was going to actually shade it in Engine, but not have a normal map on it, it would still look really nice under shading rather than having a lot of skewing on it. That said, when you're pixelating things down, you're not going to have to worry so much about the shading between seams because you're going to be relying on very large pixels to carry this through, so you can definitely get away with a lot more. I'll disable these channels so we can get back to just previewing the normal map, and I'll turn on my Pixel8r normal layer, and I want to zoom in here and show these odd seams between things that is just happening because of the interpolation that Painter applies to the texture. And there's nothing that I can really do about that except for maybe making a custom shader for Painter, but when you put this in another engine and you have all of your textures set to not doing any filtering, you won't see any of this. So I just ignore that while I'm working. And now I'll zoom in on this area so we can see how the height information is getting converted after the stack. And what I want to do to fix that is manually convert it into normals and then remove the height channel so it's not going to get double counted. So I'll search for the height to normal filter and I'll add that into my layer stack. And by default, it's set to overriding the existing normals, which I don't want it to do. I want it to combine with them. It's also very aggressive to begin with, so I can lower that height setting down. And here's what I was talking about with it being double counted. I'll switch back to the normal plus height plus mesh preview, and you can see that I'm getting the pixelated normals from this now, but it's also getting the underlying smooth normals. So I need to add a layer on top of this where I blank out the height. Once I've added that, I need to switch to working on my height channels and set that to a normal blend mode. So now it's going to be replacing that, and you can see the difference here. If I switch to the material view, you can also see the difference. So these scratches and these other features are now only present in the pixelated normal map, and I don't have anything that's not getting pixelated. So I'll do some more adjustment to this until I'm happy. I think I also want to lower this even more until it's not doing as much, but it's just barely working on it. And I think that's pretty good, but now there's a lot of detail that is reading too sharp. And this is kind of a problem when you're working with glossy and especially glossy and metallic things with a pixelated texture. Realistically, when you back up from an object in real life, the bumpy details in it start to converge out and blend together to the eye, which makes it look more rough at a distance. And that's really all that roughness is. It's just a form of microscopic height or microscopic normals, which are very closely related. I've made a filter that can do this automatically, and that's my Advanced Normals to Roughness filter. So Advanced Normals to Roughness can just be dragged into your layer stack, and you can see it working automatically. I'll switch to my roughness channel and disable this pixelator layer so you can see it a bit better. And if I disable this versus turning it on, you can see that it's boosting the roughness in areas where there's height and normal information. It doesn't actually just work on normals, it works on both of them and combines them together. And it will also output gloss information if you're using a gloss texture instead of a roughness texture, so it can do a lot more than the name implies. It also has controls for weights, which allows you to adjust how the different scales of forms are blended together into the final roughness that's getting calculated. All of this is based off of a GDC talk and paper that Valve did where they needed to convert normal information into roughness information as things mip-mapped because they were having problems with things looking overly glossy in VR. Just to really show what this is doing, I'm going to make a temporary layer where I disable everything except for roughness, and I'll make it perfectly glossy so we can preview this as a worst case scenario. And I'll enable normals to roughness, and you can see that it's starting to soften up the details, especially at a distance. I'll switch back to the roughness channel, and I'll show how you can play with some of these settings to combine different types of information so you can emphasize large-scale forms or smaller ones. So yeah, each of these weights looks at different frequency components of your height and normal map and converts them into roughness information. And so this is a really powerful filter for retaining the overall glossy look of an object without having it alias at a distance. I won't be including this in the released version of this file because it's a separate product, but I did want to showcase it here. What you can do to emulate this, though, is just boost the roughness of the procedural maps in the layer stack, and maybe use a bit of curvature and things, although they aren't the same thing exactly, and so you wouldn't be able to directly reproduce this without the filter. So I'll get back to where we were, and yeah, looking at this from a glancing angle again, it's really helping to flatten off some of this, but I still think it's overly contrasty and grainy. So I'll go down into my plastic layer, and under this roughness variations scratches layer, that's really what's doing most of it. and it has a sharpen applied to it, and this variation layer also has a sharpen applied to it. And I'm going to remove both of those because I don't want them anymore. And so I'll add a blur to this, and now I think the scratches are coming out better than they ever were before. And if I switch this back to the shaded view and we see it with and without the blur, everything's converging together a lot nicer. And I think I'll also add a subtle amount of blur to this layer to soften it up as well. So I can preview things a bit more clean. I'll also disable the quantization for my diffuse channel and also the dithering. I thought that was kind of distracting. And I also had dithering enabled on these, so I'll disable it on them for the time being. So now that everything's a whole lot cleaner and we can see all of this information coming through, I'll take a look at these channels again just to preview how they're looking. And if I look at the metalness channel here, I'm getting some of this ringing around here where I don't want it. And it looks like it's coming from some type of blending between the fabric layer and the metal layer underneath. And yeah, it's because I don't have a mask on the metal layer at all, so it was acting as kind of a base layer underneath everything. So I'll add a mask with color selection to that, and I'll select my metal. So I'll adjust my tolerance and everything else so it feels a bit softer, and I don't have any noticeable seams. And I think that's close enough that it'll pixelate down okay. And I also have a stray detail here that is probably from one of the screen layers that I painted, so I'll just go in and find that. And it's from this match LUT layer where I had painted some blue, and so I'll switch to my eraser and only erase the metallic and roughness channel, and that should take care of that. My fabric is looking really flat now, and part of the reason is because it has metallic to it, so it's getting darkened. And that was all well and good when I was working with the baked lighting and wanted it to have sort of a sheen to it, but I don't want that in PBR, so I'll disable the metalness on this layer, and if I switch back to my shaded view now, it's a lot brighter. I could boost the emissive from this just to give it extra glow, but I don't think that would work very well for this because if I were viewing it in a dark environment, it would basically be glowing in the dark. This height to normal layer where I've had to manually flatten my height, it's a little frustrating to work this way. So what I like to do instead is use a filter I've created called Better Height to Normals. And this is more configured towards what I want it to do by default. It has more controls in it, and it defaults to not overriding the existing normals, but instead blending with them, and it has different modes for combining the normals, and then everything else is pretty similar, but it also allows you to flip the green channel if you need to, and it also clears out the height channel, so you can do all of this stuff in one layer. And then it also has two different modes for switching between the sampling types, and Sobel is going to be a smoother conversion, so I'll switch between these two so we can preview what that looks like. I do think I want to make this look softer overall and not have so much noise in it still, and I think most of that is still coming from the roughness. So to be sure, I'll preview just my roughness channel, and what I'll do is go into the plastic layer again and just bring down the roughness contribution of these scratches so it better matches the underlying surface, and I'll do the same with this variations layer. So now I think that's pretty good, but I want some detail in the color, so I'll switch to adding a base color to this and brighten these up some. Now I'll change how the ambient occlusion is working, and I do like how it's darkening out the diffuse texture. I actually like most of the baked lighting remaining in this texture, although for some cases you might want to remove a lot of the baked lighting from it and rely on the shading of the engine to do things for you. But I also want to bring my ambient occlusion into the AO channel and have that be pixelated. And then I also want to bring the ambient occlusion that I had converted with my HBAO filter and have both of those be affecting things. So if I switch to my AO channel, that's completely white, and I'll add a layer and disable everything except for the ambient occlusion, and then I'll find my AO texture, and it should automatically be configured to use linear space. So if I switch back to shaded, you can see that that's doing some more work, but it's not getting combined with the HBAO layer, and I could use anchor points to bring this in, but if I actually just turn the layer back on, that should also do the trick, because it was originally getting piped into that layer. So now it's just doing a bit of darkening to that. And I think I actually want to increase the height depth of it so it's doing some more. And I like that, but it's affecting the base color channel too much, so I'll bring it down for that layer using the fill layer that I made from the anchor point. So now it's mostly just affecting the ambient occlusion channel, and some engines and shaders will allow it to appear and disappear dependent upon the lighting that the mesh is receiving. And so even though I had made a copy screen layer, I think I'll actually want to manually copy it again because I did a lot of manual paint over. So I'll make a folder and a layer, and I'll set the base color of it to pass through and disable all of the channels on it, and I'll call it grab final screen. And then I'll make an anchor point so I'm getting the contents of the screen from the base color, and then I can add a fill layer where I black out the screen. And then on the fill, I will copy the screen from my grab final screen layer and select the base color. So if I switch to my emissive channel, now it's getting everything. And I'll rename that screen diffuse to emissive. And to actually have more control, I'll change a bit how I was going to set this up. Below my anchor point, I'll create a fill and disable everything except for color. Then I'll grab my screen mask and set this to multiply and adjust the levels. And because I can't manage to get this area right here, I'll also add a manual paint where I remove some of the contents that I don't want. And then what I'll do is make that layer where I have the anchor point hidden, and I'll add another fill layer where I black out the diffuse in that region. And then using my screen diffuse to emissive layer, I can inject the hidden layer into the emissive channel. And so I'll also be able to add some paint on the blackout screen layer, just to shore up the lip of the screen. Now I have the emissive channel all on its own, being extracted from the diffuse channel, but there was a small part that I didn't like on the bars, and I found that was in the layer where I was doing some manual painting to match the colors of my LUT, and so I'll go in with an eraser brush and remove that quickly. So this has gotten a bit strange because I'm converting a diffuse asset to PBR. If I was working with PBR in the first place, I would not have to do as much cleanup as I'm doing now to get things in line, but now I'm going to add a new screen glow to that just in the emissive channel. So I'll do the same process that I had described before, where I copy the emissive channel and then add a blur to it, and then do the linear dodge mode so I can get the brightness that I want. And then I also do some levels to get that in line. I started to do some cycling between my channels again, and I thought that my metal was much too glossy to look good. So what I did to fix that was create a layer where I just added a roughness fill and set the layer's roughness channel to linear dodge, so it just did a uniform boost to the roughness. And I found that to create a nice dichotomy between a kind of glossy plastic and a more rough metal. As I'm working on a PBR asset, I'll often cycle between the channel views a lot, so I can get a nice understanding of what each of them is doing without looking at the shading. And here is where I started to think more about the fabric, and I didn't like how it was having a lot of baked-in lighting applied to it, whereas I liked it on the rest of the model. So what I did for that was create a layer where I just had a flat orange color. I also did some blending on the mask so I could have it fade in from the dark region, so it still had a little bit of that dark fall off to it, but the majority of it was very flat in just the diffuse. I rotated my environment light around some so I could see how the buttons were looking, and I didn't like that they looked overly dark. And that was partly due to them being shaded, but it's also due to the fact that metals tend to appear dark. And so for this, I decided to make it a half metal, and I also added another layer where I did something similar to the fabric, and I flattened out the shading of the metal. So I know I'm kind of working backwards at this point, where I have something very shaded, and now I'm removing a lot of shading from it to let the engine take care of it. But I still kind of like having some of this shading in the first place, because when you're working with such a low-res asset, the normals and the amount of geometry that you would tend to have on a PBR asset aren't going to be able to carry as much. So I still find that it needs at least some stuff painted into the diffuse, at least a lot more than a typical PBR asset. So yeah, here I'm just doing some work where I'm brightening things up, and at first I tried to keep it metallic, but then I decided to make it sort of a half metal. A lot of people will say that's something that isn't realistic, and they say that things should be a binary, like it should just be a dielectric or it should be metallic, but there's a lot of cases in the real world where that's just not true. If you were working on an asset that used a specular setup, you would be referencing specular charts, and there's actually a lot of instances where things have higher or lower speculars that are kind of in between. And also, when you do things like anodizing metals, you're actually oxidizing the top layer of the metal, and so it does actually lose some of its metalness. Now, it's really not that much, and you could say that maybe it should be way, way more up there at like a pure metal type range. But to be honest, I don't think that great art is really made by strictly adhering to a set of principles rigidly and not wavering from them. So I kind of take the approach where I try to understand as much as I can about how the systems work, and then I think about how I might want to bend or stretch those rules to make my art look as good as possible. I chose to do a treatment on the buttons where I decided to make them dielectric, so I did some manual paint over on top of those, and I just painted black into the metalness map, and I think that helped them stand out a lot better. There's also a case to be said that like in the real world things are like actually just metal or they actually aren't, but it comes back to when you back up from something, things start to converge together. So like when you have something that is rusted metal, anywhere that there's rust, it's not metallic, and anywhere that it hasn't yet, it is metallic, but that's going to be patchy and there's going to be spots where that's all blending. And so there's really no way that you can paint a texture where you would treat like a semi-rusted metal as being a binary unless you had almost infinite resolution to do so. I'm also going to treat the logo as if it's been painted on top with like a separate paint that was slightly rougher than the base plastic underneath. So I'll add a layer where I trace that and then paint over it with a higher roughness. And I'll do it with a fill layer so I can hone in the roughness however I want. Then I decided that I wanted my advanced normals to roughness layer to be blended in manually. So what I did for that was set the layers blend mode to normal, and then I anchor point copied it into a new layer that I set to a dodge, and I was able to adjust the levels of things, so it did a lot more aggressive on the areas of detail. And again, I apologize for not being able to release this version of the file, but if I were to do that, then you could just copy advanced normals to roughness out and use it on anything else, and I'm not going to do that. I like to spend a lot of time working on roughness because it's a very important thing for how the look of a PBR asset comes through when it's under lighting. And so here I spend a lot of time going through and manually painting some additional scuffing on the surfaces. So I've made a paint layer where I set it to linear dodge, and I just go through and scratch up the edges of things a whole lot. And you'll be able to see once I'm done with the end of this process how much it's added to it. It doesn't always come through under every lighting circumstance, but when you have really strong lighting, it's something that makes a world of difference. And this is another part where I don't have too much to talk about, but I don't want to skip it because I want you to see all of the work that I'm putting into this stage, so I'll just let a lot of this play back. And this is the point where I had decided that I wanted to make sure that the buttons were a half metal. At one point I had turned them into a complete dielectric, but I didn't really like how that was coming through, so I made a quick adjustment to that as well. So I've pretty much done all of my texturing and painting that I'm going to do. And at this point, if you weren't going to be adding any compression, this is where you could just call it and be done with things. But I do want to show some quantization applied to this. And now that I've flattened things out, it's especially having problems finding those odd oranges. And so I tried adding my LUT to that for a little bit. And I'll also show here if you try to quantize a normal map, how strange it ends up looking. I also show if you add some dither into it, how it might help alleviate some of those issues. But it's really just going to look strange and crunched down. Maybe what you could do is have it to where it has no quantizing and just a little bit of dither, like a pattern dither, so it looks like it has a little bit of noise and breakup to it. But then on the data channels, I actually did decide to generate a palette because those had a good distribution of values between everything, and so the filter was able to do a good job on those. If I switch to my emissive channel though, it's almost completely black because this is again where like the likelihood of a random seed clustering all of its samples on this one tiny region of blue is very, very unlikely. So instead of trying to adjust things to get around that, and because I don't want to show off a version of Pixel8r that I haven't released yet that could do this, I'm just going to use the bits per channel mode where I crush that sum so I can get a nice dithered look to it. And then in the end, I also decided to do the same thing on the diffuse as well. So when you have this file and you look over it, you'll see that I broke off the emissive channel where I could individually adjust it. I think ultimately I did decide to have the same amount of bits per channel for the diffuse and for the emissive. But while I was testing, I wanted to have more control over things, and so I made two separate ones. As a very last step, I was previewing this in different lighting environments, and I thought more about the screen and how it was completely black in the diffuse and it was also metallic, so it wasn't giving off really any specular reflections. And what I decided to do to keep the glassy quality to it was just boost the brightness of the base color a little bit. And so it was almost like it was like a slightly brighter metal, but it gave it sort of a look like it had a layer of glass over it. And I think that was the last step to really sell this asset. I'll do a few turnarounds of this in some different lighting environments, and I just wanted to thank everybody for all of your support, everybody who's bought Pixel8r, everybody who's watched all of these 3 videos to the end. I just really appreciate all of you.